Joining you here today with Elizabeth Davis as co-editors of Affective Politics of Digital Media, Propaganda by Other Means. We're really excited to launch this new edited collection with an amazing panel featuring many of our contributors. The format today will consist of each of them giving very short remarks, beginning with us, and we will provide our editor's overview and then each author. After this, we'll have some time for our presenters to ask questions of one another before we open up for question and answer with all of you. So as I mentioned, feel free to put your questions in the chat box and we will collect them.
All right, thank you. And hello, everyone. We're so excited for you to join us. I'm Elizabeth Davis. And just for those folks who have just come in, this presentation is being recorded, and we ask that non-presenters please do turn off your microphone and camera so that we can keep you anonymous when we post this online. So thanks for coming. We wanted to start by giving some background about the history of our work on emotion, affect, and the politics of digital media. So Megan and I began studying questions of affect and social media in 2016, prompted in particular by the surprise of the Trump election and Brexit. In 2017, we received our first of several awards from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada to conduct preliminary research on the politics of emotion in the context of the post-truth discourse that was emerging at that time. And we received a second grant, which allowed us to bring together an international group of scholars. Some of them are today's panelists. That was in June 2019 for an intimate 3-day symposium to explore interdisciplinary approaches to understanding the weaponization of emotion in digital media. So following Brexit and the 2016 US election, we had begun tracking several things pertaining to media and emotion. How news media were reporting on emotionality in politics, how digital media technologies were being designed and practices employed to capture attention using emotion and affect. And finally, we were seeking to understand various political repercussions of these affective politics of digital media. In 2016, Oxford Dictionaries named post-truth as their word of the year. And they defined it as a situation characterized by the rising influence of emotions and personal beliefs rather than facts in shaping public opinion. There was, you probably remember, quite a buzz and remains quite a buzz around this term. And we have seen that buzz as one of the kind of first flashpoints in public awareness of what we understand as a kind of sea change in social media and the overall news media environment, which has resulted in new forms of propaganda and a media environment that is nothing if not rife with disinformation. So one of the many problems with this idea of post-truth is that it seemed to propose that the presence of emotion itself is either new in politics or that there's somehow more of it now. Yet even if post-truth is a misnomer, and we do believe that it does point us toward the question of how the distribution of information and affect are tightly linked. So this entire collection foregrounds the degree to which attention economies are in fact affective economies.
All right, kind of on the wrong side there. All right, so while that post-truth buzz has brought attention to emotion in public discourse, we notice that emotion is often couched in depoliticized and generic terms that fail to capture the politics of emotion. Our book illustrates the political significance of public emotionality. It very much matters who is expressing emotion, the target towards which emotion is expressed, and the legitimacy that is granted or not to those expressing emotion. The problem of pervasive disinformation is so extensive at this point, there often is no shared reality to draw on, as we are learning increasingly day by day. Thus, while the predominant discourse on emotion and politics today tends to advocate for a return to reason or even a faith in science in the face of this fractured media environment, this book begins from the premise that the politics of emotion are intimately bound up with hierarchies of social difference, race, gender, religion, nation, and nationalism, etc. Questions about whose feelings matter and about what emotions materialize as news and whose emotions are questions about legitimacy and authority and what becomes intelligible in public spaces. In fact, post-truth, there's a cartoon of post-truth that shows it depicting whoever shouts loud enough has the claim to truth. In short, we can't just wish emotion out of politics. Rather, we have to better understand how affect shapes our political realities.
So promoting white supremacy, male supremacy, and racism are fundamentally affective enterprises. Emotions and affect are not merely individually and privately experienced, but are socially constructed and perpetuated through institutions and persistent mediated repetitions that facilitate large-scale, collectively shared perceptions and myths, such as nationalism, patriotism, ideas of us and them, and who's considered a threatening other. Of course, propaganda has always exploited emotion and desire. So what's different today? We might say that we've been witnessing a perfect storm: the shifting role of social media in shaping the news media landscape, the capacities of actors to connect, network, and organize online, and the growing level of strategic use of disinformation by all sorts of actors. All of these things, we might say, has created a perfect storm for new modalities of sophisticated propaganda, all of which exploit, target, or manage emotions in distinctive ways.
So from today's vantage point, we know so much more now about how the media landscape has been restructured with pervasive disinformation, how political actors are using social media for electioneering and propaganda, how algorithms are reshaping public spheres. Some of those key stories that have been unfolding over the past years, and I'm sure many of you have followed this, evidence the weaponization of emotion for economic, political, and often military aims. These unfolding events include the emotional micro-targeting of messages that combines behavioral science with algorithms, as we learned through the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the history of Facebook's many emotion experiments, which date back to 2008, computational propaganda that relies on bots and organized disinformation campaigns, especially used to sow confusion and mistrust, which is on the rise internationally, the wide popularity of conspiracy theories, which erode trust in common and shared sources of news and fuel paranoia, the rise of authoritarian leaders such as Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, who successfully weaponize the potent affects underlying racism and bigotry via social media, using their messaging to radically control and direct public discourse. The sensationalism that helps drive clickbait journalism and the corresponding erosion of investigative journalism as news media compete for attention, extremist organizing online in forums like 4chan and Gab that, among other things, gamify online harassment and exploit desire for connection and community. We know much more, of course, about how algorithms shape information diets, notably promoting fear and hate to sell extremist content, as has been particularly the case in recent coverage about YouTube. And finally, the major dissymmetry in partisan exploitation of digital affect. Put differently, not all political groups have the same degree of success in weaponizing digital tools to manipulate the political and news landscape. To comprehend the exploitation of new modalities of propaganda requires that we grasp the degree to which right-wing media producers have successfully weaponized media. So, our panelists today will discuss these topics and more in their contributions to our edited collection.
So although propaganda and persuasion have always relied on emotional appeals, digital media have ushered in propaganda by other means, new strategies for mobilizing and capturing affect and emotion. And the presentations that we've lined up next take up various aspects of the affective politics of digital media. And we're so grateful to the authors who contributed their work to this book. And we want to thank Vian, Bakir, and Andrew McStay, Jason Roberts and Karin Wahl-Jorgensen, Olivier Jutel, Leslie Regan Shade, Warren Sack, Luke Stark, and Susannah Passaninen for joining us to share your work today. Without further ado, we will briefly introduce each of these speakers as they present, and that will be beginning with Vian Bakir and Andrew McStay. Vian Bakir is professor in journalism and political communication at Bangor University, where she co-directs the Network for Media and Persuasive Communication. Her research investigates data surveillance, public accountability of the security state, and disinformation. Her monographs include Intelligence Elites and Public Accountability, Torture, Intelligence, and Surveillance in the War on Terror, and Surveillance, Media, and Strategic Political Communication. Andrew McStay is professor of digital life at Bangor University, and outside of academia works in advising roles for startups, NGOs, and policy bodies. Dr. McStay's most recent book is Emotional AI, The Rise of Empathic Media. He has also appeared and made submissions about emotional AI to the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner, the UK House of Lords AI Inquiry, and the UK Department for Culture, Media, and Sport Inquiries. Welcome, Andrew and Vian. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening all. Yeah, thank you so much for organizing. Great to be here. Yeah, great to meet kind of so many people that I kind of follow on Twitter and yeah, know from here, there, and everywhere. So yes, in terms of the title, you know, this question of kind of empathy, this question of emotion, this question of AI, in essence, what we're talking about is systems that pertain, that claim to read, judge, and react to emotions, affects, and other subjective states. But I think before we start thinking about technologies and before we even start thinking about kind of modern political life, I think it's really useful to just add something of a historical perspective to all of this. So, you know, David Hume, for example, in A Treatise of Human Nature, you know, spoke of emotional contagion, spoke of affections passing from one to another. So it kind of provides a framing for some of the discussion, which I'm sure will emerge over the coming half hour or so. Emile Durkheim, likewise, talks about collective effervescence in relation to group emotion, preempting questions of amplification, positive feedback loops, and so on. And similarly, Gustave Le Bon spoke of emotional contagion as undermining individual rational thought, again preempting some of these questions about the relationship between emotion, rationality, and this seeming, and I say seeming, dichotomy between the two. I'll hand over to Vian.
So, I mean, our book chapter has got emotional AI in the title. And as Andy said, you know, these are systems that claim to read, judge, react to emotions, affect. It's quite an emergent phenomenon across all sorts of sectors. But from what I've looked at in terms of social media, I would say social media platforms really are the prime site of emotional AI technologies out in the wild today. And, you know, there are so many studies on social media showing it to be a very emotional place, full of antisocial behavior, uncivil behavior, also full of positive emotions as well, which is why people go there, solidarity, collective emotions, that sort of stuff. Several really good studies showing how socially contagious emotions are on social media as well. And this is evidenced in studies on Facebook in the US, on Twitter, US, Germany, Weibo in China, so across the world. You know, and it's no surprise really that the platforms are designed this way. I mean, it's in their very design. So in our chapter on optimization of disinformation, we outline the economics of emotion. It's really just our phrase to explain the central appeal of fake news in terms of the economic drivers behind it. You know, how emotions are leveraged online to generate attention and viewing time. It's really all about generating advertising revenue from online behavioral advertising. You know, your 100% fake news websites, they're very sensationalist content, which obviously acts as clickbait. and which also incidentally studies show usually accords with users' preconceived ideas in terms of the content they propagate. We also talk about the politics of emotion as well. You know, this is a core driver of political propaganda online. We're seeing this in political campaigns across the world, the increased use of data analytics, data management approaches, all of this to profile and to identify target audiences, including those persuadable segments as well, basically to target them with messages that seem really to just stoke polarization and conflict. So up on the screen there, I mean, these are studies I've come across which show the intent, at least, to try and surreptitiously, emotionally manipulate electorates. Now, whether or not, of course, they really do this is another question, but certainly the attempts are there in America. The 2016 presidential election, there's a few studies on that. But beyond America as well, you know, the Catalan referendum for independence in October 2017, great study on that. Really showing how, you know, people, certain types of people, influencers are bombarded with very negative and inflammatory messages to try and, you know, inspire fight or violence or shame, for instance. Brazil, there's a study in Brazil, the rise of Bolsonaro there to become the president. Studies even in Africa, you know, or at least from Facebook release of data. I mean, Africa, internet penetration is pretty low compared to the global average, but smartphone penetration is quite high in a lot of countries. And, you know, unsurprisingly, they also are the targets of manipulation, often emanating from outside of Africa. Britain is not immune either with the Brexit referendum. So if you're interested in the politics of emotion, it's nice to see that there is this body of evidence, I think, emerging. But I think what we need to emphasize here, you know, whether it's for commerce or propaganda, the rise of emotional AI, in this example through social media, it allows ever more granular targeting of the emotional state of individuals and groups, really. You know, and it's characterized by real-time feedback and the optimization of content for target audiences. And you see those buttons, if anyone's familiar with Facebook, you'll be familiar with the like button. You know, in 2016, this was replaced in terms of reactions, but with 5 other responses. These are designed to allow you to give quick empathic responses on, you know, love or, you know, all the others, ha ha, wow, sad and angry. And of course, this just gives Facebook more data about how we're feeling on an emotional level, which, you know, they can monetize. Over to Angie, I think, for how this might play out in a wider sense.
And I think, yeah, you know, in terms of where we are today, much of the conversation is about social media, much of the conversation is about sentiment analysis, basically emotion and digital life mediated through screens. But things are changing, technologies are developing, and I think, you know, any situation where there's money or any gain or any profit to be made from emotion, it's been exploited, and primarily and increasingly that's happening through questions about the body. And I think, you know, in terms of where our work, certainly kind of where this book chapter is, but also kind of where our work is kind of developing further, is looking at kind of the relationship between biometrics, i.e. measurements of the body in some way, shape or form, and how this is interacting with questions about media content and also political campaigning. So be that through kind of voice-based modalities, such as voice assistants in the home, be that through kind of data about kind of core affect from the body itself in terms of wrist-based wearables, or use of cameras to detect facial expressions and so on. There's an increasing ecology and economy of emotion, which undoubtedly will be feeding into kind of the next wave of political campaigning and news. But I think in terms of, I was really pleased to see that when Megan sent out the talk prompt, she also kind of asked for an addendum as well. You know, kind of what's changed since we submitted the chapters. And there's 2 pieces of kind of draft legislation which have come out in recent weeks, in recent months. One is from the Council of Europe, Convention 108, and the second is the draft European AI regulations. The draft is extraordinarily rough and extraordinarily vague. But I think what's perhaps of interest to this group and to people on the call is that there's an increasing interest in emotion recognition. So not just biometrics, not just news, not just political campaign, but emotion recognition itself. And certainly the draft AI regulations don't just frame that in terms of biometrics. It will spill over to questions of political profiling and news. So I think this is something for us all to watch, but emotion is definitely a very good topic and a very important topic for us all to be looking at the moment. But that's it from us.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Vian. That was wonderful. We now turn to Jason Roberts and Karin Wahl-Jorgensen. Jason Roberts is a doctoral candidate at Cardiff University, and his research explores how alternative right-wing digital media actors in the United States are seeking to alter the boundaries of acceptable journalistic practice and traditional journalistic norms. He has written about and presented on right-wing media, fake news, and how readers of alternative media outlets create, utilize, and negotiate with meta-journalistic discourse while interacting with news. Karin Wahl-Jorgensen is Director of Research Development and Environment in the Cardiff School of Journalism, Media, and Cultural Studies. She has published 9 books and more than 100 journal articles and book chapters in journalism and media studies. Her most recent book, this may not be an updated bio because I know she's quite prolific. Her most recent book, Emotions, Media, and Politics with Polity 2019, focuses upon the relationship between citizenship, media, and emotion. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I should say that this is a bit of a double act. So both Jason and I will be speaking. However, Jason is the first author on this chapter because this is part of his PhD project. So Jason is fortunate enough to get to look at Breitbart day in and day out. Our chapter is titled Breitbart's Attack on Mainstream Media, Victories, Victimhood, and Vilification. And we're going to explore how that relates to the questions around the weaponization of emotion in politics that Megan and Elizabeth have asked us to consider. So specifically what our chapter looks at is how Breitbart carries out effectively charged attacks on mainstream media along with other political actors, particularly who are oppositional to the interests of Breitbart. Now, we're interested in looking at Breitbart specifically because of the site's distinctive history in the broader context of right-wing populist media, which we can see as a kind of growing force in terms of public discourse, and particularly in terms of the intersection between emotions, media, and politics. One of the things that we're particularly interested in is how Breitbart seeks to present itself as a legitimate alternative to centrist media organizations in the US. And what we argue in the chapter where we carry out a thematic analysis of how Breitbart covers media stories is that Breitbart weaponizes emotion through the use of distinctive discursive strategies. And that Breitbart's emotional appeals are communicated through the use of a very particular kind of language. This is a language that comes complete with ready-made derogatory terms, hate figures, one of them depicted on the slide, and idols, as well as institutions that are reviled and beloved. So there's this kind of peculiar language that characterizes Breitbart's discourse, which is immediately recognizable within the political community constituted by its audience. Now, through its discursive strategies, Breitbart, we argue, fosters an emotional community based on shared political feeling. One of the things that we find in our chapter is that this emotional community is mainly characterized by negative emotion. Breitbart draws very widely on the tropes of what I've referred to as angry populism elsewhere in the context of talking about the politics of Donald Trump specifically. What we see is that Breitbart tends to direct anger at the liberal political establishment whilst expressing sadness at the victimization or the perceived victimization of right-wing groups. In particular, in the chapter, we identify 3 distinct but interconnected strategies that Breitbart engages in. These include celebrating the victories of its allies, embracing victimhood by right-wing groups, and also engaging in vilification of political opponents. So one of the ways in which we make sense of this is by drawing on the work of Ali Hochschild, a distinguished sociologist of emotion. So what she argued is that if you look at Trump supporters' political beliefs, they tend to be shaped by what she refers to as an underlying deep story, which is premised primarily on emotions rather than facts, and which pits cosmopolitan, multicultural, and privileged elites against the ordinary people, quote unquote, struggling to get by in an increasingly hostile culture. Now, the strategies that we identify construct a distinctive epistemological universe which underpins this deep story, complete with the vital narrative ingredients of victories, victims, and villains. So you got this great kind of underlying story there. Through its effectively charged text, the news site claims a moral high ground, kind of ironically, as a defender of liberal democracy, because it gives voice to the concerns of the people in a public sphere that's dominated by elite and establishment voices. Now, I'm now going to hand over to Jason to talk about how we envisage these dynamics developing in the future as Breitbart and the conservative movement aligned with it move into opposition in relation to the Biden administration.
Thanks, Karin. So I think it would be good to start by recognizing Anthony Nadler's fantastic chapter that precedes ours in this collection, which contextualizes a lot of what we talk about and a lot of what I'm going to talk about now. So definitely read that if you haven't read it already. So since we published this chapter, there have been numerous changes in the American political landscape, the most obvious being that Breitbart now finds itself in opposition to the Biden administration. What we might consider is that Breitbart so frequently attacked its opposition while actually in power. We don't anticipate a huge amount of strategic change on their behalf. We think that Breitbart will continue to affectively politicize contemporary aesthetics and cultural life in an effort to assert itself and Trumpism as countercultural opposition. So, but while we expect an element of sort of business as usual on the behalf of Breitbart with regards to democratic attacks, what we've started to notice in our current work is a more concerted effort to affirm Trumpism and sort of America First countercultural conservatism at the heart of the modern Republican Party through attacks on Fox News mostly. So a lot of moderate figures on Fox News find themselves the subject of Breitbart attacks, while figures such as Tucker Carlson are routinely praised for their viewpoints. And while it's important to note that this is something Breitbart has done long before Trump and during the Trump administration, these newer attacks on Fox hosts and media personalities can be seen as a concerted effort to define the boundaries of both the Republican Party and American right-wing journalism post-Trump. I think this is one of the big areas for opportunities for further research when looking at Breitbart's coverage, is their coverage of Fox News particularly and Republican politicians. So the big question we're left with is, how will Breitbart continue to weaponize emotion and in order to normalize and define countercultural conservatism? And as the coronavirus recovery continues and the Biden administration progresses, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, which has devastated large parts of America, both socially and economically, these feelings of decline, loss, and anger that Hochschild particularly talks about in her work, and that we acknowledge as well, are set to grow in areas that have been neglected for years and decades even. So if the recovery isn't particularly swift or significant, Breitbart may be able to weaponize these feelings into further support for their cause. So thank you for listening to us. Sorry to end on that particularly dour note, but we can all look at the golden Donald Trump to recognize how they might weaponize aesthetics.
Thank you. And yes, it's a bit of an occupational hazard to not necessarily be ending on a high note in this research. Thank you so much for that description of your chapter and the update as well about how Breitbart's been developing. Thank you for that. So Megan, next, do we have a video from Olivier? Wonderful. So Olivier Jutel was not able to join us virtually. It was a bit difficult finding a time that everyone could join us because the collection is a very international collection. But we have a video from our next contributor, Olivier Jutel, who is a communications lecturer at the University of Otago. His research is concerned with digital politics, far-right populism, affective media, psychoanalytic theory, and blockchain. His ongoing research is centered on blockchain projects and experiments in the aid sector and developing Pacific economies.
Kia ora and good morning from New Zealand. It's Olivier here. Sorry I can't be in the stream with you all, but I'm really grateful to Megan and Elizabeth for organizing this, but also the opportunity to be part of this great volume. And I really hope I'm going to watch the stream back. So if there's anything interesting or useful to you in what I say, I'd love to hear from you online, email. Yeah, but let me kick this off by saying that my contribution comes out of my work in thinking about the digital and trying to kind of ground the affect in a kind of Lacanian Marxist materialist analysis, i.e., obviously the work of Jody Dean is huge, and communicative capitalism is really important here. How can we think about the role of affect in structuring communicative networks and in engaging processes of the reproduction, the reification of tech capitalism? So this work came out of thinking about the failures of some of the digital teleologies that have been foundational to kind of laying the groundwork for the internet. And Jody Dean talks about techno-democracy fetish and the fantasies of abundance and of the promise of innate human connectivity, the wisdom of crowds, all this, producage and empowerment. All of these kinds of narratives have failed spectacularly because, Trump and the far right have shown just how much they are adept at using these communicative technologies. But there will be no great solutionist synthesis produced by the discourse. The discourse and connectivity itself cannot reproduce politics. That was the kind of liberal technocratic or neoliberal technocratic fantasy. One of the digital teleologies that has been left standing in all this is blockchain. And blockchain trades on this notion during this moment of epistemic crisis and post-truth, whatever you want to call it. Blockchain produces the fantasy of immutable truth through code, truth through encryption, and it promises that you, the individual, can leave behind corrupt mediating institutions, whether in finance, whether in government, or even striking back at the FANG platforms. You can leave those behind, be empowered. Assume the identity, your own data-empowered identity, which is analogous to like a Bitcoin wallet. And from there, you will have the grand vistas of data that will sort of overcome the problems of politics, the problems of the lack, to put it in Lacanian terms, right? Immerse yourself in Web 3.0, take flight, go into that world, leave this old corrupt world behind. That's the kind of grand teleology of blockchain. I haven't the time here to tell you why it's completely transparent bullshit, why governance blockchain is nothing like cryptocurrency blockchains, about how, we know the environmental costs, we know just how much this is accelerating and reproducing the most oligarchic and rapacious forms of finance capitalism. Love to talk about that for ages. But the key question for us is how affect gets mobilized in this venture of selling us a kind of techno-populist narrative of we can have pure data mediated truth. We can realize the social world in sort of computational form, right? And what, the role of affect in this kind of grand narrative. So it's this incredible kind of grand teleology, promises of, there's all these meditations of new values, new forms of social organization that can be built around the power of networking and innate connectivity. Of course, the value, all these meditations on value end up reproducing, the most ludicrous forms of artificial scarcity in the form of NFTs and Beeple's $70 million JPEG. But there is a kind of a cybernetic sense that we can overcome, and this is a key for the Lacanian stuff, overcome the problems of mediation in language. We can have pure cybernetic levels of integration of data, but data as representing this organic, authentic kernel of human creativity. Human creativity in very stripped down, sort of anarcho-cyber-libertarian terms in which, the market is analogous to kind of an innate sense of what human life and creativity is. We need to talk about the deployment of affect. And this is something that I use here in the example of crypto kitties. So just gonna kind of play through. This is the kind of the crypto kitties promotional landing page, which tells you something about how they're inculcating the logic of blockchain through sort of kind of cutesy-fied, ironic meme culture that builds an expectation and an enjoyment, a pleasure, the affective pleasures of connecting through breeding digital beanie babies with tradable, securitizable trading papers, right? This is the sort of the logic of the NFT. All of the kind of the joy, the pleasure of breeding these digital assets in a kind of, quasi-eugenicist mastery sort of sense is produced in and through the logic of the blockchain, right? So this is similar to how Farmville was essential to kind of catapulting Facebook's advance of connections and user growth and all these sorts of things. Now, what is interesting here and what kind of cuts through my argument and I think what the stakes of affect theory are that, these notions of authentic connectivity and techno-mediation and techno-acceleration resemble the work of Brian Masumi. Well, don't just resemble. I mean, Brian Masumi's latest work, the 99 Theses, published in 2019, staked it all on blockchain as being able to capture that excess of affect, of human connectivity as something which resides outside of the kind of logics, the coercive and disciplinary logics of tech capitalism, right? So this is a very Deleuzian phenomenological notion of affect, which crashes against the rocks for me of kind of the Lacanian problem of how desire, jouissance, and these fantasies can be completely reinscribed into communicative capitalism. But this is a very popular theoretical gambit. Jonathan Boler, who's another person whose work on computational capitalism I respect deeply, and he's talked about how computational capitalism is about turning us into affective and libidinal strip mines. Nevertheless, blockchain is a techno solution, a techno acceleration past the worst excesses of communicative capitalism for him. I'm not buying. So blockchain for me is the most kind of fanciful, affective, deterministic notion of human connectivity and mediation, which belies or obfuscates a deeply sort of transactional, possessive individualist, brutally kind of legalistic, cyber libertarian conception of the social, in which there's a sort of like natural oligarchy and feudalism that takes shape. But this relies on a kind of an alchemy of affect in the digital, and the story of, you know, NFTs and, you know, Beeple's $70 million JPEG it functions as a social proof. It functions as this new kind of wondrous world of value in a time where we're, I guess, desperate for solutions and, you know, caught in the kind of various crises of communication and tech capitalism. So that's me, already run over time. Sorry about that. Best wishes for the panel. I'll be checking back in on all of y'all, and I'd love to hear from you guys. All right, take care.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivier. And next, we turn to Leslie Regan Shade, who is a professor in the Faculty of Information here at the University of Toronto. Her research and teaching focuses on the policy aspects of information and communication technologies. She is a co-investigator on the E-Quality Project, a partnership of scholars, community organizations, educators, policy institutes, policymakers, and youth, funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And she's exploring the experiences of young people's privacy and equality in networked environments. Over to you.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you very much, Megan and Elizabeth, for putting together this incredibly valuable collection and for reminding me of the really awesome experience we had being together for a couple of days in a room in June, talking and workshopping a lot of these papers. I kind of totally forgot what that experience is like. So that was a happy memory. As Megan says, I'm part of the Equality Project, which is a SSHRC funded partnership that consists of scholars, community organizations, some government entities, policy institutes, and youth themselves. And we're looking at experiences of youth privacy and equality in networked environments. So a lot of my interest in this particular topic, which is looking in this chapter at the affective dimensions of health and well-being, especially related to children and young people, emanates from my work in this project. And for a couple of years now, I've been very interested in this whole idea of tech regulation. And I started to survey industry responses and various government initiatives to regulate big tech, with a look at what was happening in the United States, Canada, and the UK. But I decided in this chapter to hone in on UK initiatives, as their studies are quite unique in their attention to the affective dimensions of social media on health and well-being. An acknowledgement that persuasive design and code target emotion and can trigger negative effects for health and well-being, particularly for vulnerable populations, including children, and that there is a need to create ethical design mechanisms for the protection of various groups. So what I did in this chapter is I took a deep dive into some of these reports. As you can see here, a couple from the House of Commons, the Disinformation and Fake News Final Report, and the Immersive and Addictive Technologies Report, and the Online Harms White Paper, as well as the Regulating in a Digital World Report from the House of Lords Select Committee on Communication, other reports from civil society organization Five Rights Foundation, looking at persuasive design and young people, Royal Society report on public health, and age-appropriate design from the Information Commissioner's Office, looking at codes of practices. What these UK investigations recognize is this unprecedented and cavalier ways in which social media platform companies operate, right? It's all of the Zuboffian elements of surveillance capitalism writ large. In general, The reports call for tech companies to rein in design and algorithms that are addictive, leading to unhealthy lifestyles, to develop codes of practice or principles for data and algorithmic transparency, to redress various harms that can be social, psychological, or economic, to ensure robust industry responsibility towards the safety of their users, and to create digital and data literacy programs. So how does this impact children and young people? In their introduction to this collection, Megan and Elizabeth describe how the affective weaponization of information exploits, manipulates, and surveils emotions. Affective information warfare, they highlight, weaponizes emotions through digital technology to exploit, incite, and target emotions for profit and political gain. Indeed, young people can be at ground zero in this cycle of communicative capitalism, where attention economies are affective economies. Persuasive design features in kids' platforms includes reward and gamification strategies, notifications, nudges, summonses, alerts, pings, lights, streaks, stickiness features, a whole bevy of features. And it can contribute to this sort of relentless valorization of popularity that persuasive design promotes. And this can definitely impact the health and well-being of young people. Addiction, anxiety, anger, depression, distraction, sleeplessness, a culture of self-sharing that can often result in low self-esteem, over-exaggeration, performative behavior, and et cetera. And it can often, very much normalize data surveillance across digital environments. So it could very well be the case that these various recommendations towards the protection and safety of children, okay, it's not just children that are impacted by all of these persuasive technologies, but it could be that this is a way that tech regulation sort of can recognize the need to address these systemic and structural problems endemic to the tech industry. Notably, this business model reliant on behavioral marketing for profit, persuasive design techniques that reel users into spending excessive times on the platforms. And so this very well could be the impetus to sort of think about digital policy reforms on affect and emotion and provide a resilient link to a more healthy and trustworthy democratic culture. Perhaps. I'm not so sure I'm that optimistic at this time. Megan Elizabeth asks, is there any addendum that you would like to offer since finishing this chapter? And indeed there is. There's been so much happening in terms of tech regulation in the United States and the EU and the UK, Canada, et cetera. This is just a screenshot here from today's New York Times. A global tipping point for reining in tech has arrived. So a variety of initiatives that are happening globally. And so this is interesting and good news, but it's difficult to keep up with all of the events that are happening. But as well, last month, a general comment on children and the digital environment was released. And this updates, after 30 years, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, an international treaty that recognizes that all children have universal human rights and which delineates particular rights of children encompassing the principles of protection, provision, and participation. The general comment accounts for a range of children's digital rights, access to information, freedom of expression and thought, the right to education and digital literacy, the right to culture, leisure, and play, protection of privacy, identity and data processing, protection from violence, sexual exploitation and other harms, and health and well-being. Of note, the general comment remarked that the digital environment plays a key role in children's development and can facilitate their participation at local, national, and international levels, but that children's digital leisure time may expose them to risks of harm, including misleading advertising, persuasive or gambling-like design features. Further, the general comment recommended that digital practices that rely on neuromarketing, emotional analytics, immersive advertising in virtual and augmented reality environments to promote products, applications, and services should be prohibited from engagement directly or indirectly with children. And the general comment also emphasized that children's digital platforms and services, whether for infotainment, education, entertainment, or care settings, are steeped in surveillance capitalism. So any digital surveillance of children should thus respect children's rights to privacy. And data protections need to include privacy by design features, safety by design approaches. And digital and algorithmic literacy should include, so if you're thinking about what folks should know about digital and algorithmic literacy, understanding infrastructures, understanding its political economy and business practices, understanding how persuasive designs and strategies work, what the role of automated processing and personal data and surveillance are, and what might be the possible negative effects of this sort of constant digitization on societies and communities. So lots happening. Thank you once again, Megan and Elizabeth, for letting me contribute to the collection and reminding me what a fun journey it's been to work with y'all.
Thank you so much, Leslie.
Thank you, Leslie. And thanks for your quick description of your chapter and those updates as well. I feel like all of us, even though the book has just come out, we're all ready for volume 2. Well, maybe not quite ready to put that work into it, volume 2, but certainly our thinking is evolving as we go. So next we have Warren Sack. Warren is a media theorist, software designer, and artist whose work explores theories and designs for online public space and public discussion. He's chair and professor of film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he teaches digital arts and digital studies. His artwork has been exhibited by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum, the Walker Art Center, and the ZKM. His recent book, one of his recent books, is called The Software Arts. And I'll hand it over to you, Warren.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Megan, for organizing this. It's really a delight to be here and an honor to be included in this collection. Our chapter, as it was an interview with several of us, Megan and Elizabeth conducted an interview with Wendy Chun, me, and Sarah Sharma, was entitled Beyond Behaviorism and Black Boxes, The Future of Media Theory. There we go. So it's not necessary to read this story from last week's New York Times to understand the title. Feeding Hate with Video, a former alt-right YouTuber explains his methods. Focus on conflict, feed the algorithm, make sure whatever you produce reinforces a narrative. Don't worry if it's true. Journalism and popular culture have convinced us that the YouTuber's methods are obvious. What is left unexplored in the article is something considerably harder to demonstrate, a cause and effect link between watching the channel and embodied hate or the performance of hateful acts. So don't get me wrong, I'm not one of the deniers who say that media productions have no influence on their viewers. What I am saying is that the influence advertised by the producers, like this YouTuber, is not necessarily the influence delivered by the media produced. And this is the case largely because media producers are paid according to how well they can target a specific audience. And so they, the producers, are motivated to exaggerate the influence of their productions on the desired demographic. Establishing a connection between a media production and its affect or influence is the bread and butter of audience measurement and profiling as practiced by advertisers, ratings companies, and propagandists since the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, profiling and measurements of populations goes back centuries earlier, according to Armand and Michel Matlar's little book, Theories of Communication, where they write about, quote, the two axioms of crowd psychology, namely that the mass exalts affectivity and inhibits thought. The 19th century sociologists Scipio Sigeli and Gustave Le Bon both wrote books on crowd psychology and dynamics in which they argued that crowds were the product of psychic contagion, a theoretical framework echoed today in the vocabulary of viral communications and memes that draws an analogy between speech and infection and reduces people to disease host without individual thought or language. This dehumanizing rhetoric of crowds and mobs is very much present in contemporary analyses of social media, such as David Easley and John Kleinberg's 2010 Cambridge University Press book entitled Networks, Crowds, and Markets. To paraphrase the two axioms of crowds identified by the Matlars, crowds feel, but they don't think. Early 20th century sociology, of course, moved on from crowds to publics, a sophisticated construct in which it was assumed that people feel, think, and have opinion. Yet now, a century later, especially in the popular discourse on social media, the explanations offered about their workings often elide this longer history of publics and public opinion, and instead provide us simplistic explanations. So in our discussion with Megan Boler, Elizabeth Davis, Wendy Chun, Sarah Sharma, and I, we consider the strategic decisions that are likely motivate these simplistic explanations of the workings of social media. For example, right now in Silicon Valley, the preferred terminology is bizarrely predominantly a vocabulary of behaviorism. Why do people keep going back to Instagram? Well, Silicon Valley explains, it's a dopamine hit. One can hear this over and over again in print publication and documentary films like The Social Dilemma. The social media companies are explaining their product using vocabulary of behaviorism, where their product is us, an audience or voting public. The producers of these products explain their efficacy in terms that many psychologists of the 1950s and before would have felt perfectly comfortable using. In academia, of course, we've moved on from behaviorism because we know that stimulus response pairs might describe the conditioning of dogs and rats, but are too simple as models to explain the cause of conscious articulated actions taken by humans. So even if these theoretically and methodologically antiquated or cartoonish presentations for how, for example, Facebook works are inadequate for explaining what they purport to explain, they're strategically useful because they provide the buyers, usually political campaigns or advertisers of products, a clear picture of what they're being sold by the social media companies. Our chapter in the book touches on the history of these kinds of strategic decisions for simplistic explanations as detailed, for example, in Ian Eng's 1990 book about the history of audience measurement, Desperately Seeking the Audience. In the interview, we touched on a number of subjects, but repeatedly returned to the anxieties caused by new media technologies, whether or not those new media technologies do warrant the anxiety they cause, and whether or not the industrial and theoretical discourses that attempt to describe and shape the workings of new media technologies run aground by borrowing anachronistically from earlier discourses, or perhaps whether these anachronisms are strategically deployed to camouflage their true workings and shore up a pernicious vision of liberal politics and conviviality. In Wendy Chun's words, she asked us to ask ourselves not how these technologies work or purported to work, but how they're made to work. In the end of the interview, Sarah Sharma sums things up like this. Quote, "What lurks inside this dream of conviviality across great divides is actually the of the wounded white male identity and his claims to injustice. And with this stance comes the suggestion that social justice for the disenfranchised and structurally marginalized is not a necessary public good, but rather something that could be up for debate." Thank you.
Wow, that is so provocative and creates great room, I think, for question and answer between us today. That's fantastic. Thank you, Warren. So next, Luke Stark is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. His work interrogates the historical, social, and ethical impacts of computing and artificial intelligence technologies, particularly those mediating social and emotional expression. He was previously a postdoc researcher in the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics Group at Microsoft Research Montreal, and a postdoctoral fellow in sociology at Dartmouth College. Luke.
Thank you so much, Megan. Elizabeth, thank you for this great collection and for having me participate in it. It's been such a pleasure. I echo Leslie's nostalgia for in-person meeting in June of 2019, and I hope we can do that again soon. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that the lands on which I'm located here in London, Ontario, are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Etowandran peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. I respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous peoples have had with this land and acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples in Canada, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, have endured. And I ask that we recognize the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory by honoring and respecting Indigenous communities and striving for restorative justice for Indigenous people and all those who have been marginalized. So I don't have slides, but I will just make a few remarks based on the prompts helpfully provided for this event. And in doing so, kind of give you a little bit of an overview of my chapter in the book, Empires of Feeling, which really, uses Facebook, perhaps in a cliche way, as an index case for some of the ways in which the topics we talked about today around the weaponization and manipulation of emotion and emotional expression online have played out over the last decade or so. And I think just one thing to say, broadly speaking, about the ways in which emotion and media are weaponized in political context today, right, are that they're weaponized in ways that are both, have positive and negative affective valence, right? So, we've heard a lot today and rightly hear a lot about, kind of negative appeals, often in the context of far-right politics, and appeals to this kind of negative pathos that's often cloaked in the language of logos, right? I think this idea, I think that Sun Ha Hong talks about in his contribution to the book, this phrase, facts don't care about your feelings, right? Often used to signify this supposed logos, right? Which is often the most emotive possible expression, is a testament to that. But I think we also can remember that, emotional labor as the work of control and projection of emotive expression is also ubiquitous, and is also a form of emotional or emotive weaponization, right? I'm thinking here of influencer culture and various kind of more quote unquote positive emotions that can also be weaponized in many contexts. I was delighted, Warren, that you ended your talk on Wendy Chun's brilliant point about the making of the making of these systems and how they work, and on Sarah Sharma's point about white male masculinity, because I think one of the things that I want us all to keep in mind in this context is whose emotions are acceptable and what makes them so. And I think generally speaking, there's a long history of some people's emotions being acceptable and some people's being not. So I'll flag 3 points from my chapter that sort of intersect this question around affect, media, and politics. Much of the chapter looks at the kind of changing rhetoric from Facebook's top brass about what they think their app is doing, and kind of lines it up with the company's increasing interest in tracking and instrumentalizing certain forms of emotive expression. So going, from kind of the early days of Facebook, when Mark Zuckerberg in 2004 talked about, just browsing around and seeing whose people's friends are, and just checking out people's online identities to see how people portray themselves, and just find some interesting information about people, right? Which has this kind of both kind of juvenile and prurient sense, right, from this sort of Harvard University days. Moving through the kind of era in the 2010s of connection for connection's sake, through to now in the last 2 or 3 years under much scrutiny, to the move from connection's sake to building community and doing good, and a focus on meaningful social interaction. So we have this kind of trajectory that Rob Hunt, in his contribution to the book, also focuses on in a different context, towards meaningful emotional interaction, in a way that makes us question, and I do question in my chapter, what it means to be meaningful in this space. One thing to flag, right, is that the idea of connecting the earth through communicative mechanisms is a long-standing imperial project. It's been a dream that has been articulated through, basically certainly through every electronic form of communication, going back to Marconi and the telegraph. And so, this idea that Facebook is going to, kind of promote a kind of world, world sphere of frictionless emotional connectivity is in some ways not really very new. I think pointing to this question about the current mode at Facebook around meaningful social interaction, I talk in the chapter about how my read of this rhetoric is that goodness, making good connections, is defined by Facebook as through this notion of care, and that care is defined by attention, right? Attention is kind of metricizable thing that that can be a proxy for care. And of course, attention then is defined by metrics of personalization, right? So, fitting adds to models of desire, which have been shaped by records of a user's past behavior. And so we can sort of see in real time Facebook redefining what it means to make a meaningful interaction or a good connection to, to conform with what the platform can measure and what the platform can monetize. And then finally, I think, what this chapter has let me do, and what I've done in other more recent work, is start to try to think about this notion of what I call emotive politics. Right? What does that mean? A politics that is really defined around the surface expression of emotion, around the kind of play of emotions, without potentially a lot of reflection, and also then reflecting or critiquing that in a meta way, why reflection might be seen as a value we would want, and who this idea of reflection benefits and who it doesn't. So that's something that I'm still thinking about, and I really value thoughts and reflections in the Q&A on this idea of emotive politics, right? Attention not just to attention and affective intensity, but also around valence and reflection. And to conclude, I just want to point to what's new as per the prompt, right? So about a month ago or 3 weeks ago, Nick Clegg, a VP at Facebook, a former British politician, wrote a lengthy blog post that sort of tried to defend the company against its critics and sort of articulated all the things that the company has done, both in the past and in the present, to as a defense against the claims that it was a uniquely problematic actor in the generation of negative content online, and also around political polarization. And I want to just flag, in this trajectory of Facebook's rhetoric, an interesting shift in the Clegg piece, to a critique of what Clegg calls the sensational, right? And so what Clegg is very, very trying to clearly to do is redefine negative content on the platforms as sensational content, as opposed to the meaningful kind of connections I've already mentioned. And I think it's interesting to think about what the history of the term sensation, sensationality, again, in the context of industrial modernity, and the context of especially around race, and who is understood as having more or less sensation, right? So classically, racist tropes around Black Americans are that they are less prone to sensation, they're less prone to pain, but that paradoxically they're also more prone to an animatedness, as the affect theorist Sian Nye talks about. So I'm interested to think more about this idea of the sensational and how that is becoming the supposed enemy that Facebook wants us to consider. So that's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Luke. That's fascinating. A fascinating note to end on the sensational being taken up in that way. Thank you for that. Next, we have Susannah Passaninen, who is professor of media studies at University of Turku, Finland. Her research interests include media theory, internet research, sexuality studies, affect, and pornography. She's the author of several books on popular culture, affect, sexuality, and media, including, but not limited to, Carnal Resonance, Affect, and Online Pornography, Many Splendored Things, Thinking, Sex, and Play, Who's Laughing Now? Feminist Tactics in Social Media with Jenny Sunden, and forthcoming, I believe, in print, but only available on pre-order. Maybe you can fill us in, Susanna. Distracted, Frustrated, Bored, Affective Formations in Networked Media. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, my Dependent, Distracted, Bored book is out today, but it's very much, it's from MIT, and it's very much a virtual book for me because I don't have copies myself because of COVID and Brexit. I'll probably see the copies in the autumn if I'm lucky. But it's out now and I'm very happy because it took 10 years to produce that book. So yes, I'm very pleased. So I'll be the last one to go. My contribution to the book was an interview we did with the lovely editors and Zizi Papakrisi. It's called Affect, Media and Movement. And since it's an interview discussion thing, it sort of has an organic rhythm. It's not really built around an argument. But basically we're investigating, like I think all of us in the book, are investigating relations between affect and politics, and of course Zizi's work on affective publics is very much about how affect is mobilized and how political affect mobilizes bodies through network means in ways that kind of do away with the division of online offline that once was very kind of structuring in terms of internet research, if we think back something like a decade or two. But it's of course always been the case that affect is key to social political organization, to activism. I mean, think of the Nazis, think of the feminist movement, think of any movement. It's about bodies feeling together, and whether that's feeling together in shared social spaces or whether that's through network means, of course, makes a difference. But then it's a challenge. Well, actually, it's our kind of job as media scholars and as cultural studies scholars to think what happens in these spaces that are hybrid. They are networked, but they're also physical, and the kind of online offline thing just doesn't work. And in particular, what this means when our sociability is being platformed centrally through data giants. I mean, think of Facebook as a company. They've increased their market share of social media. So I think now they have something like 2.8 billion active users globally, up by 600 million from a year ago. And the very concrete power that they have to create the structural means through which we can relate or through which we cannot relate. So this affective politics, politics is always about affect, then meets platform capitalism and what happens in this particular moment. It's particularly interesting. And of course, since finishing that discussion interview, the whole pandemic happened and our lives have been platformed to an unprecedented degree. And I think many things have come into sharp focus. And the least of those definitely is not. I mean, it's a major thing. Well, platform capitalism, of course, is a major thing, but basically the very concrete power of select social media platforms to organize sociability in ways that exclude and include. It's also become, at least in my bit of the world, I'm in Helsinki, Finland, so it's become also a topic of public debate and political discussion. Of course, I mean, EU has all kinds of issues in terms of regulation and attempts to regulate data giants. But I think with the pandemic, many issues that are key to the book have really just come into very sharp focus. So it's kind of almost like a laboratory moment for thinking about platform lives. One of our most recognizable populist politicians, Timo Soini, who founded the Finns Party, which is a national populist party, recently in an interview said that if you fail to evoke emotion, you may appear smart like a liberal, but you won't get any votes. And that basically summarizes much of the kind of populist cause. And in the interview that we did with Cici, we're also talking about populism and how that's compatible with the attention economy of social media, basically, how simplification, repetition, amplification, affective amplification that are key to the making of populist politics are also key to how certain things start to trend or gain attention in social media. But I think when we're talking about populism as a political style, I think it's important to sort of leave the door open to the fact that it's a political style that doesn't need to be specific to, let's say, the right. And this is something that Emilia Paasonen, who's a Finnish political scientist, works a lot with the work, works through Ernesto Laclau's take on populism, basically writes about this openness as populism as a style of relating. And then the question is why the right is so much better at the populist game on social media platform, and to what extent social media platforms and the way they are designed. I mean, thinking of Wendy Chan's work on homophily, the love of sameness, filter bubbles, echo chambers, and so forth, how that particular design of sociability seems to amplify certain political voices and not others. Of course, not exclusively so. I mean, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, global school strike for climate. I mean, all kinds of activist projects constantly do unfold on social media. But in terms of how political debate happens, it's interesting that certain kinds of populist voices seem to find this different kind of amplification. And of course, in the social media attention economy, it's not particular a structure where, let's say, well-balanced, long critical views on politics are going to thrive, because it is about polarization of opinions. It's about users outdoing one another. The very kind of particular dynamics of debate do feed a soundbite economy. But it's not just social media, it's also a soundbite economy of something like TED Talks that seems to be a kind of an organizing logic in terms of sociability and also in terms of just how academic work might gain visibility or not gain visibility. And I find it kind of fascinating. Of course, it's always the case that when we publish something, a publisher wants to come with a soundbite that they can market the book, because I mean, it's a capitalist system of publishing. But I'm really interested in how that soundbite economy has become a particular also attention economy. And I think TED Talks do deserve a lot more critical attention that they have been gaining. I think we really need to do a lot of work about what they achieve and what they don't achieve, and what the whole economy really is about, and what that is doing in terms of our academic work in humanities and social sciences in particular. Of course, there is critical work on TED Talks, but I think their ramifications really haven't been dealt with quite. So in the interview, we talk about populism, we talk about bodies being mobilized to social action, we talk about platform economy, platform capitalism, and the kinds of spaces for social organization and activism that social media allows for or does not allow for, how it conditions our ways of relating. And of course, I'm this is a very similar concern that Luke just raised before, how platforms are designed. And I guess ultimately the point of that would be how, well, just as I'm arguing for the necessity of critiquing TED Talks and the whole thing that goes around them, the very basic action of platform critique when it comes to affect and how it's mobilized and how it's weaponized in social media really remains crucial. And of course, in the year that we've been living in, thinking of what happened on Capitol Hill in the US, what's been happening in many other countries, I mean, things are kind of being amplified, I think, in these times when we are largely relating through networked means. And I think all of this just basically makes the anthology even more topical, because when I first saw the table of contents, I was thinking like, oh, I wish this was out yesterday, because it's definitely a book that I want to teach and discuss with my students and my PhD students in particular. I think it really speaks to multiple interests. In the part, I mean, I'm in a very specific, as we all are in a specific cultural context, but where I am, I think it really speaks to very acute concerns. And I think in the year after finishing the interview, it's just become even more so, in ways depressing and not. I also think that at this particular moment, we are having much more critical debate around the networked means of relating, the economies that lead to this. And I just wish that something like Facebook will actually be taken into task about the work they have been doing to, let's say, redefine democracy, if I'm being polite. Let's call it redefinition and not destruction. But that's really for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. That was a lovely recap of some of the themes, and I think leads into some of the questions that came in the chat. Given time, we'll let things run a few minutes late, but I wanted to just try to summarize the couple of questions in the chat and open it up to all of our panelists today. One thing that I have noticed is in the research that we are doing currently is that the right and the left certainly share a very significant critique of quote unquote big tech, building on what you were just pointing to, Susanna. And a couple of the questions ask about the political left, which resonates as well with Luke's comment about how can we think about positive emotions. And so with regard to the left, one person asked, are there ways in which there are similar weaponizing strategies as we saw with Breitbart? And another person asked about the ways in which Breitbart and the alt-right have co-opted strategies, in fact, from Occupy Wall Street to turn and attack Fox in this move we've seen where the far right is moving farther right in terms of their critiques of media. So it's a question of how the left is operating similarly and how left strategies are being borrowed by the right. And there was another question about what it might look like to have emotional defense, to develop media education strategies that might quote unquote protect us from some of this. So I'm just going to open that up to any of the panelists who might want to comment.
Oh, sorry. I might lead off because I think a couple of those questions were addressed at Breitbart. I mean, historically, I think Susanna touched on it, the left has been poor to utilize affect appropriately, and that's not only left politicians, but also left media. So as a result, I don't see as much sort of affective strategies with regards to that first question about how Breitbart weaponized affect regarding Trump. I see less of that the one exception I would make would be humor and satire, which is often neglected as when we think about sort of affect. And a symposium that Karin and I were at a few months ago talked at length about the possibilities for humor, satire, and affect as a means of sort of creating political change, and the extent to which that actually is a sort of not necessarily valid form of political participation, but an effective one. And I think that is the closest thing to the sort of weaponization of affect that the right uses, that the left has now, that I can see.
If I could just add to what Jason's saying, one of the things that I've been asked about many times, particularly last summer, is about the use of emotion in Black Lives Matter. And there, I think that the emotion of anger has, like in other social movements, been mobilized in a really, really powerful manner. Not necessarily, I mean, there are complications, as Susanna also pointed out, around how the left might mobilize emotional narratives, but nonetheless, I think that anger has served as a really powerful mobilizing emotion in the context of facilitating those protests in what was already a very charged and difficult environment. So that's one place where I've seen kind of emotional appeals playing out really powerfully on the left.
We could say something about emotional defenses, if you like. That's a really good question about what would be the emotional defense against all of this. From my survey of communications research, there's really very little on this, very little. And I think we really need to give more thought to this, especially as emotional AI technologies actually become more pervasive. Do we even understand what was being measured, and then therefore what might be being manipulated? I mean, and I just posit as against this. There's been so much now on solutions to disinformation, so much. Not that we've really come to a unified understanding, but, you know, there's stuff about inoculating people against disinformation. There's stuff about digital literacy. There's stuff about prompts within social media, like, have you read this before sharing, you know, to try and reduce the virality. We really do need to be spending as much attention, I think, just to the very emotionality, not to disinformation, which is important, but difficult actually to actually say, is this true or is this not true in many cases, because deception is such a broad spectrum. We definitely need to be applying that to emotion. I think at a design level, some people are trying to do that already. They're just not very popular yet. So if you think of social media as a prime site of emotional AI, for instance, you know, I mean, Tim Berners-Lee's Solid platform, there is a social media app for that called Darcy, which hasn't really launched yet, but that actually aims not to monetize the user, right? So you pay, I think, for your social media presence, but you're not the product. So in a sense, you know, you're sort of going against the viral monetization of people. But as to the actual philosophical strategies that might be employed to teach people emotional literacy, I think it's such a great question. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Andy, at all.
Yeah, I think whichever way around, the answer has to be structural and collective. I think kind of the danger with literacy solutions is it kind of pushes out to the individual. I much prefer the idea of structural responses, be those kind of be those technological or be those policy solutions.
Yeah, I think that's, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you so much for that answer. That was my question, and that was a really great answer for me to hear. I appreciate you addressing it. Thanks.
I've done a review of every media education handbook that came out basically since 2016 or between 2016 and 2018, and everyone recognized that this was a problem, and no one has a sense of how to do that. And I would agree that the concern is it does get individualized. The responsibility ends up going to the individual.
If I could also just quickly
Yes,
jump in.
please.
I mean, I think that you know, one of the interesting questions to which I don't have a good answer yet is, you know, are there, you know, are the tactics and strategies of political change, do they sort of come, and this comes out of my interest in kind of the values embedded in particular technologies and techniques, do they come with particular, you know, emotive or emotional charges? And I mean, I'm thinking here, you know, of the, to this point about the right co-opting elements of the left, and I think this is like, you know, this is sort of the Alinsky rules for radicals being taken up by right-wing actors. I mean, you know, those tactics work differently depending on who is perceived to be the you know, the cultural authority, right? And so even though we you know, it's very clear that we have a long way to go in terms of equality, you know, the discourses in at least North America, you know, can allow the right to position themselves as insurgent, even though what they're an insurgent, and that insurgency is intrinsically a good thing, even though actually, you know, it's, in this case, it's anti, you know, anti-democratic and anti-human. So so that's one thing to say. I'll stop there. Yeah.
I'd also add to that, Lucas, the immense financial backing that a lot of those agitators that apply to those. Andrew Breitbart was an enormous Saul Alinsky fan.
Well, I think given time, we need to unfortunately close this. I'm sure there are many more questions, and there are a few, but I know some of us have to move on. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will be sure to get these materials uploaded so your colleagues and friends can also view it, and we will let you know about that. And thank you to our panelists for making time so generously.
Thank you, Meg.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.